Eleanor Hamilton's weathered hands froze mid-reach toward the tranquilizer gun, her 72-year-old body trembling as 5 massive African lionesses formed a perfect circle around her in the blazing Serengeti sun. The lionesses weren't snarling or preparing to attack. They were bowing their heads in what could only be described as reverence. Jake Morrison dropped his rifle, blood still seeping from the lion trap wound on his leg. "Ellie, don't move," he whispered, his voice cracking with 30 years of safari experience. "I've never seen anything like this." Marcus Steiner, the German hunter who'd been tracking this pride for weeks, stumbled backward, his high-powered rifle clattering against the acacia tree. His weathered face drained white as parchment. The dying male lion called King lay between them all, his golden mane matted with blood, amber eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intelligence that made her breath catch. She remembered her late husband Henry's words from their honeymoon here 50 years ago. "Some bonds transcend species, Ellie." "Dear God," Eleanor breathed, "what have we walked into?" Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Boston's Beacon Hill as Eleanor Hamilton stood at her bedroom window, staring at the empty Mercedes in her driveway. 5 years had passed since Henry's funeral, yet she still set the table for 2 each morning, still bought his favorite Earl Grey tea, still spoke to his photograph as if he might answer back from beyond the grave. "Today's the day, darling," she whispered to the silver-framed image on her nightstand. "I'm finally going to scatter your ashes in Tanzania, just like we planned." Her voice cracked on the last words. At 72, Dr. Eleanor Hamilton had outlived her husband of 52 years and their only son, David, who died in a car accident just 6 months after Henry's heart attack. The Hamilton medical equipment fortune, built over 3 generations, now belonged to a woman who had no one left to share it with. 3,000 miles away, Jake Morrison pressed his palm against his chest, feeling the familiar ache that had nothing to do with his damaged heart and everything to do with the cancer eating away at his lungs. The 45-year-old former Marine stood outside his weathered cabin near the Serengeti, watching the sunrise paint the African sky in shades of gold and crimson. His satellite phone buzzed with another missed call from his daughter Emma in Colorado, their 15th attempt at reconciliation that he'd ignored in as many months. "Daddy issues," he muttered, lighting his 3rd cigarette of the day despite knowing it was accelerating his death sentence. The doctors in Arusha had given him 6 to 8 months, maybe less if he kept smoking and refusing treatment. But treatment meant going home to America, meant facing Emma's questions about why he'd abandoned her and her mother 15 years ago when the nightmares got too bad. His radio crackled with the voice of Samuel, his Tanzanian assistant. "Bwana Jake, the American lady is here, very rich, very sad. She pays triple rate for remote safari." Jake stubbed out his cigarette and grabbed his rifle. Rich Americans were his bread and butter, even if most of them came to Africa trying to buy experiences that couldn't fill the holes in their souls. This one sounded different, though. Samuel had mentioned she traveled alone, carried an urn, and specifically requested the most isolated areas of the Serengeti. Meanwhile, in a luxury camp 50 miles south, Marcus Steiner cleaned his hunting rifle with methodical precision, his 58-year-old hands steady despite the tremor of grief that never quite left him. On the wooden table beside him sat a photograph of a 12-year-old boy with bright blue eyes and a gap-toothed grin, his son Tommy, who'd lost his battle with leukemia 3 years ago. "Today, Tommy," Marcus whispered in his German-accented English, "today, Daddy proves he's still strong enough to protect what matters." The trap network he'd spent months setting across the Serengeti represented more than illegal hunting. It was his war against a world that had taken everything from him. starting with the lions that symbolized the wild strength his fragile son had never possessed. None of them knew that within 72 hours, their broken paths would converge around a dying lion and 5 lionesses who would change everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the bonds that transcend species. The Land Cruiser's engine coughed to life at dawn, its weathered frame protesting the early hour as Jake Morrison loaded Eleanor's expensive luggage into the back. She emerged from the guest tent, looking every inch the Boston socialite. Designer safari clothes that probably cost more than most Tanzanians made in a year, perfectly styled silver hair, and sunglasses that couldn't quite hide the deep circles under her eyes. "Mrs. Hamilton," Jake nodded, stubbing out his morning cigarette. "Beautiful day for a drive into the Serengeti. Please, call me Ellie." Her voice carried the refined accent of old Boston money, but Jake caught something else underneath. A bone-deep weariness that he recognized from his own mirror. "And thank you for agreeing to take me to the remote areas. I know it's unusual." Jake studied her as she climbed into the passenger seat, noting how she clutched a small silver urn against her chest like a lifeline. "Mind if I ask what's in there?" "My husband." The words came out matter of fact, but Jake saw her knuckles whiten around the urn. "Henry. We honeymooned in Tanzania 50 years ago. He always said if anything happened to him, he wanted his ashes scattered where the lions roam free." The 6-hour drive into the heart of the Serengeti began in silence, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional call of birds overhead. Jake found himself stealing glances at his passenger, recognizing something familiar in the way she stared out at the endless grassland, the same hollow look he'd seen in war veterans who'd lost too much. "You remind me of my daughter," Eleanor said suddenly, then caught herself. "I'm sorry. That came out wrong. I meant you have the same careful way of watching the world. Emma was like that after her father left." Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Kids adapt." "Do they?" Eleanor's voice was soft. "Emma's 30 now. Still won't return my calls. Blames me for not fighting harder to keep her father around." She was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I think children need someone to blame when life falls apart. Parents are convenient targets." The words hit closer to home than Jake cared to admit. His own daughter Emma, 16 now, not 30, had stopped answering his calls 3 months ago. Her last text had been brutal in its simplicity. "Stop pretending you care, Dad." "What about you?" Eleanor asked. "Any family?" "Daughter. Back in Colorado." Jake's jaw tightened. "Haven't seen her in 2 years." "Divorce?" "PTSD." The words came out harsher than he intended. 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Came back different. Wife couldn't handle the nightmares, the drinking. Can't say I blame her." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Henry used to wake up screaming sometimes. Korea, 1952. 50 years of marriage, and he never told me what he saw over there." I learned not to ask. By midday, they'd reached the coordinates Eleanor had specified, a remote watering hole surrounded by acacia trees, far from any tourist routes. Jake set up camp while Eleanor sat in the shade, still clutching Henry's urn. The silence between them had evolved from awkward to comfortable, the kind that comes between people who understand loss without needing to explain it. "There," Jake said, pointing across the grassland. "Your lions." Eleanor lifted his binoculars, gasping at what she saw. A magnificent pride lounged near the water, one massive male with a golden mane and 5 females of varying ages. But even from 200 yards away, something seemed wrong. "The male's limping," Eleanor observed, her veterinary training kicking in automatically. "That's not a natural gait." Jake took the binoculars, studying the pride with growing concern. The male lion, easily 400 pounds and in his prime, favored his back left leg significantly. "You're right. Trap wound, most likely." "Trap wound?" Eleanor's voice sharpened. "You mean someone's been setting traps out here?" "Poachers. They're after rhino horn mainly, but they'll take lion parts too. Big money in traditional medicine markets." Jake's expression darkened. "Whoever's doing this knows what they're about. That's a professional setup." As if summoned by their conversation, the male lion rose and began walking toward the water. On his third step, there was a sharp metallic clang that echoed across the savanna, followed by a roar of pain that made both humans instinctively step backward. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed, grabbing his rifle. He just walked into another trap. The lion's roar of agony continued, a sound that seemed to tear the very air around them. Within seconds, the 5 lionesses were on their feet, racing toward their fallen leader. But instead of the chaos Jake expected, something extraordinary happened. The lionesses formed a perfect protective circle around the trapped male, their heads low, their eyes scanning for threats. They weren't panicking or scattering. They were organizing, like soldiers protecting their wounded commander. "Jake," Eleanor whispered, her binoculars still pressed to her eyes. "I've studied big cats for 40 years. I've never seen behavior like this." The male lion's roars gradually subsided into low, pained whimpers. The trap, clearly designed for much larger prey, had clamped around his hind leg with devastating force. Blood pooled in the red dust beneath him, and his breathing became labored. "We have to help him," Eleanor said, standing up. Jake grabbed her arm. "Lady, that's a death sentence. Those lionesses won't let us within 50 yards of their pride leader." Eleanor shook off his grip, her eyes blazing with purpose. "Then we'll have to find a way to make them trust us." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Eleanor Hamilton stared through the binoculars at the dying lion, her hands trembling not from fear, but from a surge of purpose she hadn't felt in 5 years. The male's breathing had become shallow, his magnificent golden mane now matted with sweat and blood. The 5 lionesses maintained their protective circle, occasionally nuzzling their leader's massive head, their low, rumbling sounds carrying across the savanna like a funeral dirge. "Mrs. Hamilton, Ellie, please listen to me," Jake said, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that came from 15 years of guiding wealthy tourists who thought money could solve everything. "Those are wild African lions, not house cats. They will tear us apart without hesitation if we get between them and their pride leader." Eleanor set down the binoculars and turned to face him, and Jake was startled by the transformation in her face. Gone was the grief-stricken widow. In her place stood someone with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison, I didn't spend 40 years as a veterinarian, 12 of those specializing in big cats at the San Diego Zoo, to watch a magnificent animal die because I was too frightened to act." Jake's jaw dropped. "You're a veterinarian?" "Was. Retired when I married Henry." Eleanor was already moving toward their supplies. "But some things you never forget. That trap is designed for rhinos. The pressure per square inch is probably crushing muscle, tendon, maybe even bone. Without immediate intervention, that lion will die within hours from shock and blood loss." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd assumed she was just another rich American widow looking for adventure to fill the void in her life. Instead, she was possibly the most qualified person within 1,000 miles to save the lion's life. "Even if you could treat him," Jake argued, "how do you propose we get past 5 protective lionesses? They're not going to step aside and let us operate." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying the pride through the binoculars again. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, almost wondering. "Jake, in all your years out here, have you ever seen lionesses behave like this?" "Like what?" "They're taking shifts. Watch carefully." Eleanor handed him the binoculars. 2 are hunting. See them stalking that impala herd about half a mile northeast. One is grooming the male, cleaning his wounds. One is on sentinel duty, watching for threats. And the fifth, Jake focused the binoculars on the fifth lioness, a smaller female who was doing something he'd never witnessed in 15 years of safari work. She was gathering grass and small branches, creating what looked almost like a nest or bed around the trapped male. "That's impossible," Jake whispered. "Lions don't build nests. They don't organize like this." "No, they don't," Eleanor agreed, "which means this pride is either extraordinarily intelligent or—" She paused, a strange expression crossing her face. "Or they've learned to trust humans before." Before Jake could ask what she meant, the sound of an approaching vehicle made them both freeze. A dust cloud was rising from the southern ridge, and within minutes, a battered Land Rover came into view. Jake cursed under his breath as he recognized the vehicle and, more importantly, the man climbing out of it. Marcus Steiner looked exactly like what he was, a predator in human form. Tall, lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent tracking animals through harsh terrain. He carried a high-powered rifle with the casual confidence of someone who'd used it many times before. His pale blue eyes, so much like his dead son's, swept the scene with professional assessment. "Well, well," Marcus called out in his German-accented English as he approached their camp. "Jake Morrison, I should have known I'd find you here, playing protector to the wildlife." "Marcus," Jake's voice was flat, deadly. "What are you doing in this sector?" "Same thing you are, I imagine. Watching that magnificent male die slowly." Marcus gestured toward the trapped lion with his rifle barrel. "Beautiful specimen. That mane alone would bring $50,000 from the right collector." Eleanor stepped forward, and Jake was alarmed to see her hands clenched into fists. "You're the one setting the traps." Marcus's pale eyes fixed on her with interest. "And you are?" "Dr. Eleanor Hamilton. And if you've been setting illegal traps in protected territory, I'll see you prosecuted to the full extent of international law." Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "International law? Out here?" He gestured at the vast emptiness around them. "We're 30 miles from the nearest ranger station, lady. Your laws don't reach this far." "Those lions reach this far," Eleanor said quietly, and something in her tone made both men look at her sharply. Marcus followed her gaze to the pride, and for the first time his confident demeanor wavered slightly. The two lionesses who had been hunting had returned carrying fresh meat. But instead of eating, they were laying it near the trapped male, as if offering him first choice despite his inability to feed. "What the hell?" Marcus breathed. "It gets stranger," Jake said grimly. "They've been maintaining a protective formation for hours, taking organized shifts. It's like they have a plan." Marcus raised his rifle, sighting along the barrel toward the male lion. "Well, their plan is about to be cut short. That cat's worth more to me dead than alive." Eleanor stepped directly into his line of fire. "Over my dead body. That can be arranged," Marcus said. But Jake heard something hollow in his voice, a brittleness that spoke of a man pushed past his breaking point. "Marcus," Jake said carefully, his own rifle now in his hands, "think about what you're doing. That's murder we're talking about." "Murder?" Marcus's voice cracked. "You want to know about murder? My son Tommy died because I couldn't afford the experimental treatments. 12 years old, and I watched leukemia eat him alive while rich doctors told me there was nothing more they could do. These cats represent everything wild and free that my boy never got to experience. If I can't save him, I'll destroy what he loved." The raw pain in Marcus's voice hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She understood the desperate rage of a parent who'd lost a child. She'd felt it herself when David died. But she also saw something else in Marcus's eyes, something that reminded her of her own darkest moments after Henry's death. "Killing them won't bring Tommy back," she said softly. "No," Marcus agreed, his rifle still trained on the Pride. "But it might make the pain stop for a while." As if sensing the escalating tension among the humans, the largest of the lionesses, clearly the Pride's matriarch, rose to her feet and took several deliberate steps toward their group. She didn't snarl or flatten her ears in aggression. Instead, she sat down exactly halfway between the trapped male and the three humans and fixed them with a steady, almost intelligent gaze. "Jesus," Jake whispered. "It's like she knows what we're talking about." The lioness opened her mouth and let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a roar, not a growl, but something else entirely, something that sounded almost like, "She's asking for help," Eleanor breathed, her eyes wide with amazement. "Dear God, she's actually asking us for help?" The standoff stretched across the scorching afternoon like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus Steiner's rifle remained trained on the Pride, while Eleanor Hamilton stood defiantly in his line of fire, her silver hair whipping in the hot African wind. Jake Morrison found himself caught between two people whose pain had driven them to opposite extremes, one seeking to destroy, the other desperate to heal. The matriarch lioness maintained her vigil, her amber eyes moving from human to human as if she could somehow understand the tension radiating between them. Behind her, the trapped male's breathing grew more labored, his massive chest rising and falling in irregular patterns that made Eleanor's veterinary instincts scream with urgency. "Please," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I know what it's like to lose everything. When Henry died, when David was killed in that accident, I wanted to burn the whole world down too. But this isn't the answer." Marcus's hands trembled almost imperceptibly on his rifle. "You don't understand. Tommy was everything. My wife left me because I spent our savings, sold our house, liquidated everything trying to find a cure. The doctor said there was a treatment in Switzerland, experimental but promising. $30,000. I was 15,000 short." "So you turned to hunting," Jake said quietly. "I turned to surviving," Marcus snapped. "These trophy hunters pay enormous sums for a perfect male lion. One kill could have saved my son's life." His voice cracked. "But I was too late. Tommy died while I was still setting traps, still chasing the money I needed to save him." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "And now you're trapped just like that lion, caught in something that's slowly killing you." Before Marcus could respond, a sharp crack echoed across the savannah. The wooden pole securing the trap had finally succumbed to the male lion's struggles, and the massive animal was attempting to drag himself toward the water, the steel trap still clamped around his leg like a grotesque shackle. "He's making it worse!" Eleanor cried, starting toward the lions. "The movement is increasing the tissue damage." "Stop!" Marcus swung his rifle toward her. "Don't take another step." But the lionesses had already reacted to their leader's movement. The four healthy females moved in perfect coordination, two positioning themselves on either side of the male to support his weight, while the other two created a protective barrier facing the humans. It was a display of organized intelligence that defied everything Jake knew about lion behavior. "Marcus, look at them," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder. "Really look. They're not just animals acting on instinct. They're thinking, planning, cooperating in ways that—" A gunshot shattered the air. Eleanor screamed as the bullet whistled past her ear, so close she felt the heat of its passage, but Marcus hadn't been aiming at her, or at the lions. He'd fired into the air, his face contorted with anguish. "I can't," he sobbed, lowering his rifle. "God help me, I can't do it. Tommy would hate me. He loved animals more than anything, and I've become the thing he would have despised most." The gunshot had an unexpected effect on the Pride. Instead of scattering in terror, the lionesses moved closer together, their formation tightening protectively around their wounded leader. The matriarch took several steps toward Marcus, her massive paws silent on the red earth. "She's not afraid," Eleanor whispered. "After everything humans have done to her kind, she's not afraid of us." Jake stared at the approaching lioness, and something stirred in his memory, a fragment of a dream or a half-forgotten moment that felt important but remained just out of reach. The lioness was magnificent, her coat golden in the afternoon sun, her eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost familiar. "We have to try," Eleanor said suddenly. "That lion is dying, and those lionesses are going to die with him if we don't act. Marcus, you said you were a trauma surgeon before Tommy got sick. Jake, you know this terrain better than anyone. I have the veterinary knowledge. Together, we might actually be able to save them." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks in the dust on his weathered face. "You're talking about performing surgery on a 400-pound lion surrounded by 5 protective females. It's suicide." "Maybe," Eleanor agreed. "But it's the right kind of suicide, the kind that creates something instead of destroying it." Jake found himself thinking about his daughter Emma, about their last conversation 3 months ago when she'd accused him of running away from everything that mattered. "What would we need?" Eleanor was already moving toward their supplies. "I have basic veterinary equipment in my luggage, tranquilizers, antibiotics, surgical tools. It was supposed to be for the orphanage I planned to visit in Arusha." She paused. "Before I decided there was no point in visiting anywhere ever again." "I have field surgery experience," Marcus said quietly. "Military training before medical school. I know how to work with minimal equipment in hostile conditions. And I know every water source, every safe route, every place to take shelter within 50 miles, Jake added. If something goes wrong, I can get us out." The 3 humans looked at each other, and Eleanor saw something passing between them, a shared recognition of people who had lost everything and found themselves facing a choice between surrender and one last desperate fight. "The matriarch," Jake said suddenly. "She's been watching me specifically. Not Eleanor, not Marcus, me." "Why would a wild lioness—" He stopped mid-sentence, his face paling. "Oh my God!" "What?" Eleanor demanded. Jake's hands were shaking as he pulled out his binoculars and focused on the lioness. 15 years ago, when I was stationed at Camp Simba, there was a poaching incident. Military patrol found a dead lioness and 5 cubs, maybe 8 weeks old. They were going to put the cubs down, said they wouldn't survive without their mother." Eleanor's breath caught. "What did you do?" "I bottle-fed them for 3 months, against orders, against regulations. I named them, talked to them, slept next to their cage to keep them warm." Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "Amara, Nia, Kenya, Zara, and Hope. When they were old enough, Wildlife Services relocated them to this sector of the Serengeti." Marcus stared at him. "You think these are the same lions?" "I think that matriarch just recognized my voice," Jake said, wonder in his tone. "Amara." "That's Amara." As if responding to her name, the lioness rose and began walking directly toward Jake. Eleanor grabbed his arm, but he gently shook her off. "If I'm right," Jake said, "she remembers me. She remembers that humans can help instead of hurt." The lioness stopped 3 feet from Jake and sat down, her massive head tilted slightly as she studied his face. Then, in a movement that made all 3 humans gasp, she extended one enormous paw and gently placed it on Jake's boot. "Sweet Jesus," Marcus breathed. "She's greeting you." Jake knelt down slowly, extending his hand toward the lioness. "Hey girl, is that really you, Amara?" The lioness leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Jake's palm, a rumbling purr vibrating through her massive chest. Behind her, the other 4 lionesses had also risen and were approaching, their movements cautious but not aggressive. "They remember," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "After 15 years, they remember the human who saved them." Jake was surrounded now by 5 adult lionesses, each one nuzzling him gently, their purrs creating a symphony of trust that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. "Nia, Kenya, Zara, Hope," he whispered, touching each one. "You beautiful girls. You grew up so strong." The trapped male lion let out a weak roar, and immediately the lionesses turned their attention back to their leader. But now, instead of excluding the humans from their protective circle, Amara looked directly at Jake and then at the wounded male, her message unmistakable. "She wants us to help him," Jake said. "She's asking us to save him." Eleanor was already assembling her medical supplies. "Marcus, I need you to calculate dosages for tranquilizers. A male lion that size, approximately 400 pounds, probably stressed and dehydrated." "Jake, can you keep the girls calm while we work?" "I can try," Jake said, still marveling at the lionesses surrounding him, "but we need to move fast. That leg is badly damaged, and he's losing blood." As they prepared for the most dangerous veterinary procedure any of them had ever attempted, none of them noticed the second dust cloud rising from the eastern ridge, or the fact that Marcus's radio was crackling with voices speaking in rapid Swahili about armed poachers heading toward their coordinates. The real test was just beginning. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Eleanor Hamilton knelt beside the massive male lion, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her 72-year-old body. The tranquilizer had taken effect quickly. Too quickly, she realized with growing alarm. The lion's breathing was becoming dangerously shallow, his massive chest barely rising and falling. "His heart rate is dropping," she called to Marcus, who was sterilizing surgical instruments with bottled water and antiseptic. "The stress and blood loss made him more susceptible to the sedative. We have maybe 30 minutes before we lose him entirely." Jake maintained his position at the head of the pride's protective circle, his hands gently stroking Amara's massive head while the other 4 lionesses formed a living barrier around the makeshift surgery site. The scene was surreal. 3 broken humans performing emergency surgery on a wild African lion while being protected by the very predators that should have been trying to kill them. "Trap mechanism is more complex than I initially assessed," Marcus reported, his trauma surgery training evident in his clinical tone. "It's not just crushing the leg, there are serrated edges designed to prevent escape. Whoever built this wanted to ensure maximum suffering." Eleanor's jaw tightened as she examined the wound more closely. "Sadistic bastard. The trap has severed the femoral artery partially. That's why the bleeding is so severe but not immediately fatal. It's designed to weaken the animal slowly." "Can you repair it?" Jake asked, his voice tight with concern as he watched the lion's breathing become more labored. "I can try," Eleanor said, threading surgical wire with hands that hadn't performed this delicate work in over a decade. "But I need absolute stillness." "Marcus, can you hold the leg steady while I—" The crack of a rifle shot echoed across the savannah, and a bullet whistled past Eleanor's head, so close she felt dirt spray from where it struck the ground beside her. All 5 lionesses immediately rose to their feet, their earlier calm replaced by protective fury as they scanned for the source of the threat. "Poachers," Jake said grimly, grabbing his rifle and using the binoculars to scan the horizon. 3 vehicles, maybe 12 men. They're surrounding us." Marcus's face went pale. "They followed my radio signals. I've been using their frequency to track lion movements." His voice cracked with self-loathing. "I led them right to us." Eleanor continued working despite the gunfire, her veterinary training overriding every survival instinct. "I'm not losing this lion because some cowards with guns want to play soldier." "How long do we have?" 10 minutes, maybe less," Jake replied, watching the vehicles close in from 3 directions. "They're professional, coordinated approach, cutting off escape routes." Another shot rang out, this one closer, and Amara let out a roar that seemed to shake the very air around them. But instead of fleeing, the lioness positioned herself directly between Eleanor and the approaching threat, her massive body serving as a living shield. "They're protecting us," Marcus breathed in amazement. "The lionesses are actually protecting us from the poachers." Eleanor's hands never stopped moving as she worked to repair the severed artery. These girls know the difference between people who help and people who hurt. They've learned to recognize the smell of gunpowder, the sound of trap springs, the voices of men who mean them harm. Jake's radio crackled with harsh voices speaking in a mixture of Swahili and broken English. "American woman, American man, German hunter," one voice called out. "You interfere with our business. Leave now or die with the cats." "Tell them to go to hell," Eleanor said, without looking up from her surgery. Jake keyed his radio. "This is Jake Morrison, licensed safari guide. You're in protected territory, and I've already radioed Ranger headquarters with your coordinates." Laughter echoed from the radio. "No Rangers within 50 kilometers, Morrison, and your radio signals tell us exactly where you are." The male lion's breathing hitched, and Eleanor felt panic rise in her throat. "He's going into shock. Heart rate dropping critically. Marcus, I need epinephrine. There should be an emergency kit in my bag." Marcus dove for Eleanor's medical supplies just as another bullet whined overhead. This time, all 5 lionesses erupted in coordinated roars that seemed to carry for miles across the savannah. The sound was primal, terrifying, and somehow defiant, a declaration of war against anyone who threatened their pride. "Here," Marcus said, handing Eleanor a syringe, but as she prepared to administer the life-saving drug, his face suddenly went white. "Eleanor, look at the lion's chest. There's something carved into his mane." Eleanor glanced where Marcus was pointing and gasped. Burned into the lion's mane, barely visible beneath the matted hair, were letters, "T.S. 2021. "Tommy Steiner," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "That's my son's initials. I branded this lion 3 years ago when I first came to Africa after Tommy died. I was drunk, crazy with grief. I wanted to mark something, to claim ownership of the power I thought I needed." Jake stared at Marcus in shock. "You've been hunting the same lion for 3 years?" "I've been hunting him because he carries my son's name," Marcus said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "And now you're trying to save the life I've been trying to take. The irony is, God, Tommy would have loved this lion. He had pictures of lions all over his hospital room wall." Eleanor looked up from her surgery, her eyes blazing with understanding. "Then help me save him. Help me give your son the memorial he deserves." The poachers were close enough now that they could hear voices and the sound of boots on hard ground. Jake estimated they had maybe 5 minutes before the circle closed completely, but something extraordinary was happening among the lionesses. Naya and Kenya had begun circling the perimeter, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Zara and Hope positioned themselves at strategic points, creating overlapping fields of observation. And Amara remained at Eleanor's side, but her posture had changed. She was no longer just protecting, she was commanding. "It's like watching a military unit deploy," Jake murmured. "They're using battlefield tactics." Marcus looked up from holding the lion's leg steady. 15 years ago, when you bottle-fed these cubs, were there any military personnel involved in their care?" Jake's eyes widened. "Colonel Peterson used to visit them. Said watching them reminded him of his grandchildren. He'd talk to them about strategy, formations, team coordination. We all thought he was just an old soldier being sentimental." "Maybe he was teaching them," Eleanor said, never stopping her delicate repair work on the severed artery. "Maybe they learned from him the same way they learned to trust from you." A shout in Swahili came from their left, and Jake saw armed figures moving through the acacia trees. "Contact left, about 200 meters." But as the poachers advanced, something unprecedented happened. The 5 lionesses began to move in perfect military formation, Amara giving what could only be described as silent commands through subtle body movements, the other 4 responding with precision that would have impressed any drill sergeant. "They're flanking," Marcus said in amazement. "The lionesses are executing a flanking maneuver." Eleanor felt the lion's pulse strengthen under her hands as the epinephrine took effect. "Artery repair is holding, but I need another 10 minutes to close and stabilize." "We don't have 10 minutes, Jake said grimly, as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. That's when Amara did something that made all 3 humans freeze in astonishment. The massive lioness looked directly at Jake, then at Eleanor, then at Marcus. She opened her mouth and let out a sound none of them had ever heard from a lion. Not a roar, not a growl, but a low, rumbling call that seemed to carry complex meaning. "She's talking to us," Eleanor whispered. "She's actually trying to communicate." Jake found himself responding instinctively, making soft clicking sounds with his tongue. The same sounds he'd used to calm the cubs 15 years ago. Amara's ears perked forward and she nodded her massive head once, deliberately. Then she turned toward her pride and let out a series of short, sharp vocalizations. The other 4 lionesses immediately began moving, spreading out in a formation that would put them between the humans and every approaching threat. "They're going to fight," Marcus said, his voice filled with awe and terror. 5 lionesses against 12 armed men. "They're going to die protecting us." Eleanor's hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the weight of what was happening. "Then we'd better make sure their sacrifice means something. Help me save this lion's life." As gunfire intensified around them and the lionesses prepared for their final battle, Eleanor Hamilton worked with the desperate precision of someone who had finally found a reason to live again, while Jake Morrison and Marcus Steiner discovered that redemption sometimes comes in the most unexpected forms, in the trust of 5 lions who remembered kindness in a world full of cruelty. The gunfire erupted like thunder across the Serengeti as 12 armed poachers closed in from 3 directions, their automatic weapons chattering death into the golden afternoon air. Eleanor Hamilton bent over the unconscious male lion, her surgical hands steady despite bullets whistling overhead, while Marcus Steiner held the massive leg in position and Jake Morrison tried to coordinate their defense from behind the meager cover of their overturned land cruiser. "Amara, no!" Jake screamed as the magnificent lioness launched herself toward the eastern flank where 3 poachers were advancing through the acacia trees. But his cry was lost in the chaos of gunfire and the terrifying roar that erupted from the lioness as she charged straight into the bullets. The first poacher's shot went wide in his panic as 400 pounds of enraged female lion crashed into him with the force of a freight train. His scream cut off abruptly as Amara's jaws closed around his throat, but not before his dying finger pulled the trigger one final time. Eleanor felt the bullet tear through her left shoulder, spinning her away from the operating table they'd improvised from equipment cases. "Eleanor!" Marcus shouted, catching her as she stumbled, blood spreading across her khaki shirt. "Keep working," she gasped, forcing herself back to the lion. "I can finish this. Don't let her sacrifice be meaningless." But Amara wasn't finished. Even with blood streaming from bullet wounds in her flank and shoulder, the lioness rose from her first kill and continued her charge toward the second group of poachers. Behind her, Naya and Kenya had engaged the western flank, their coordinated attack scattering the men who had expected easy targets, not military precision from wild animals. Jake watched in horror and amazement as his girls, the cubs he'd bottle-fed 15 years ago, executed what could only be described as a combat operation. Zara had taken high ground on a rocky outcrop, using her elevated position to leap down onto poachers trying to flank their position. Hope circled behind enemy lines, cutting off their retreat and forcing them into the killing ground where her sisters waited. They learned more than trust from that colonel, Jake breathed, firing his rifle at a poacher who was drawing a bead on the wounded Amara. They learned war. Marcus worked frantically to assist Eleanor as she sutured the lion's repaired artery, her hands shaking now not from age but from blood loss and shock. "We need to evacuate," he said. "You're going into shock, and these wounds—" "No!" Eleanor's voice was weak but determined. "This lion lives, or we all die here. Those lionesses are dying for him. I won't let that be for nothing." A scream from the eastern flank made them all look up. Amara had taken down 2 more poachers, but the effort had cost her dearly. She was moving slower now, her left rear leg dragging from what looked like a shattered hip. Blood matted her golden coat, and her breathing was labored. Yet she continued to fight. Nia suddenly appeared beside Eleanor, the lioness limping badly but carrying something in her massive jaws, a poacher's radio. She dropped it at Eleanor's feet, and through the static came panicked voices in Swahili and English. "Team 3 is down. The cats are— Jesus Christ, they're hunting us. Fall back to the vehicles. Fall back. Something's wrong with these lions. They're not acting normal." Jake managed a grim smile as he reloaded his rifle. Normal lions would have run at the first gunshot. These girls learned different lessons. But their victory was Pyrrhic. Kenya was down, a spreading pool of blood beneath her still form. Azara had taken multiple hits but continued fighting with single-minded fury. Hope was nowhere to be seen, either dead or too wounded to continue, and Amara, their magnificent leader, was clearly dying on her feet. The matriarch lioness made eye contact with Jake one final time, her amber eyes holding the same intelligence and trust he remembered from 15 years ago. Then she turned toward the remaining poachers, 5 men who had regrouped near their vehicles and were preparing for one final assault. "She's going to charge again," Marcus said in horror. "She can't possibly survive another attack." Amara gathered herself for what everyone knew would be her last battle. Her powerful muscles bunched despite her wounds, and she opened her mouth in a roar that seemed to come from the very soul of Africa itself, defiant, proud, and utterly fearless. That's when Eleanor Hamilton made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Jake," she said quietly, never looking up from the lion's surgery, "your rifle. Give me your rifle." "Eleanor, what are you—" "Give me the rifle." Her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had made peace with the unthinkable. "I'm not watching that brave girl die alone." Jake handed her the weapon with shaking hands, and Eleanor Hamilton, Boston socialite, respected veterinarian, grieving mother and widow, rose to her feet despite the blood streaming from her shoulder wound. "Amara," she called softly. The lioness turned, her massive head tilted in question. Eleanor raised the rifle, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, woman and lioness looked at each other across the space between species, across the vast divide between civilization and wildness, across 15 years of separation and a lifetime of different worlds. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, "for everything." She pulled the trigger. The shot was clean, merciful, precise, a veterinarian's shot that ended suffering rather than causing it. Amara collapsed instantly, her pain finally over, her sacrifice complete. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the remaining poachers seemed stunned by what they had witnessed. An elderly American woman putting a wounded lioness out of her misery with the kind of steady compassion that spoke to something deeper than mere kindness. Marcus stared at Eleanor in shock. "You killed her." "I loved her," Eleanor said simply, tears streaming down her face. "That's what love does sometimes. It makes the hard choices so others don't have to." Jake was sobbing openly now, his rifle forgotten as he knelt beside Amara's still form. "She saved us all. They all did." The sound of vehicles starting up came from the poacher's position. The surviving men were retreating, their appetite for the fight broken by what they had witnessed. 7 of their number were dead, killed by lions who fought like soldiers and died like heroes. Eleanor returned to the male lion, her hands steady again despite her wounds. "Almost finished," she murmured to Marcus. "Just need to close and stabilize." But as she worked, she became aware of movement around them. Nia, despite her injuries, had dragged herself to Amara's side and was nuzzling her fallen leader. Zara limped over to join her, her own wounds forgotten in grief. And from the rocks above came Hope, carrying something in her mouth. "Dear God," Marcus breathed. Hope was carrying a lion cub, tiny, maybe 6 weeks old, clearly one of Amara's offspring. As they watched in amazement, she was followed by 2 more lionesses, each carrying cubs. The Pride had hidden their young during the battle, and now the survivors were bringing them to meet the humans who had fought beside their mothers. "There are more," Jake said wonderingly. "The Pride is bigger than we thought." Eleanor finished her surgery as the sun began to set, painting the Serengeti in shades of gold and crimson. The male lion's breathing was stronger now, his heart rate steady. He would live, scarred but alive, marked by Marcus's grief, but saved by Eleanor's skill and the sacrifice of 5 lionesses who had learned both love and war from the humans who raised them. As night fell over the battlefield where lions had died for humans and humans had killed for love, Eleanor Hamilton sat beside Amara's still form and whispered the prayer she had never been able to say for her husband or son. "Rest now, brave girl. You've earned your peace." The surviving cubs crept closer, drawn by instincts they didn't understand to the human whose hands smelled of healing and whose tears fell like rain on the red African earth. The first light of dawn painted the Serengeti in shades of gold and amber as Eleanor Hamilton sat beside the recovering male lion, her shoulder wound roughly bandaged with strips torn from Marcus Steiner's shirt. The big cat's breathing was steady now, strong, his amber eyes occasionally flickering open to observe the strange tableau around him. 3 humans and 4 surviving lionesses maintaining a vigil that transcended species. Jake Morrison knelt beside Amara's still form, his weathered hands gently stroking the magnificent lioness who had died protecting them all. "I should have kept you safe," he whispered. "Should have found a way to save you all." "She made her choice," Eleanor said softly, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and grief. "Just like we all did." Marcus sat apart from the others, staring at his hands. Hands that had once saved lives in operating rooms, then taken lives in these same grasslands, and yesterday had helped save a life again. The radio beside him crackled with increasing urgency as Tanzanian authorities coordinated a massive search and rescue operation based on the GPS coordinates Jake had transmitted before the battle. But it was the 4th member of their group who held the most stunning revelation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the American wildlife researcher who had arrived with the rescue helicopters, knelt beside the male lion with instruments that seemed impossibly sophisticated for field use. At 29, she possessed credentials that would have impressed Eleanor in her prime: degrees from Harvard and Cornell, published research on African predator behavior, and most remarkably, a 5-year study documenting unprecedented cooperative behaviors in Serengeti lion prides. "This is extraordinary," Sarah said, reviewing footage she'd captured on motion-activated cameras placed throughout the region. "The tactical coordination these lionesses displayed, it's beyond anything in the scientific literature. They executed flanking maneuvers, coordinated distractions, even seemed to designate roles based on individual strengths." Jake looked up from Amara's body. "You've been watching them?" "For 3 years," Sarah confirmed. Ever since reports started coming in about a pride that behaved differently. Lions that seemed to understand human intentions, that could distinguish between threats and allies. I've been documenting their interactions with ranger patrols, tourists, even poachers. She paused, studying Jake intently. But I never understood the source of their behavior until now. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What do you mean? Sarah activated a tablet, showing video footage of the lion pride from various angles and time frames. Look at this clip from 18 months ago. The same lionesses, I can identify them by scars and markings, protecting a ranger who was injured by elephant charge. And this one from last year, leading a lost safari group to water during drought. The footage was undeniable. The lionesses had been helping humans long before yesterday's battle. There's more, Sarah continued, her scientific excitement barely contained. I've documented 17 separate incidents of this pride intervening to protect humans from other predators, natural disasters, even other lions. It's as if they've been running their own rescue operation. Marcus stood up abruptly, his face pale. Show me the dates on those interventions. Sarah scrolled through her data. First documented case was February 15th, 3 years ago, then March 3rd, March 19th, continuing regularly since then. Marcus's legs gave out and he collapsed to his knees. Tommy died February 12th, 3 years ago, 3 days before their first rescue. His voice broke. They've been saving people in his memory. The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. Eleanor felt tears she didn't know she still had streaming down her cheeks. The lions, they've been honoring your son? Not just honoring, Sarah said, her scientist's mind grappling with the implications. Learning, evolving, creating a cultural tradition of human rescue that they've been passing down to their cubs. Jake stared at the surviving lionesses, Nia, Zara, Hope, and the 2 newcomers who had brought their cubs. But how did they know? How did they understand that Marcus lost his son? Sarah pulled up another video, this one showing Marcus during one of his hunting expeditions 2 years prior. In the footage, he was clearly emotional, talking to himself as he set traps, mentioning Tommy's name repeatedly. Sound carries far in the Serengeti, Sarah explained. Lions have excellent hearing, and they're incredibly intelligent. They may have associated the name Tommy with human grief, just as they learned to associate Jake's voice with protection and care. Eleanor looked at the recovering male lion, understanding dawning. That's why they brought him here. They knew Marcus had marked this lion with Tommy's initials. They were bringing him to us, to the source of the grief, so we could heal what was broken. The male lion, Tommy, Eleanor found herself thinking, stirred more fully awake, his massive head turning to study each human in turn. When his gaze fell on Marcus, something passed between man and beast that made everyone present hold their breath. Marcus approached slowly, his hands shaking. Hey, big guy. I'm sorry for what I did to you, for what I've done to your family. The lion's amber eyes held no anger, no fear, only a kind of patient acceptance that seemed almost human in its complexity. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. Something I've been afraid to report because it challenges everything we know about animal cognition. Eleanor looked up from checking the lion's surgical site. What? The lionesses have been teaching, not just their own cubs, but other prides. I've documented the spread of human protective behavior across 6 different prides in this region over the past 2 years. They're creating a culture of cooperation with humans. Jake's radio crackled with the voice of the helicopter pilot. Ground team, we're showing multiple incoming aircraft. Looks like media, government officials, maybe international wildlife organizations. Word about yesterday's events is spreading fast. Eleanor sighed, suddenly feeling every one of her 72 years. They'll want to study them, won't they? Turn this into a spectacle. Over my dead body, Marcus said with quiet fury. These lions have given enough. They deserve to live in peace. Sarah closed her tablet with a decisive snap. Which is why I'm recommending immediate protected status for this entire region, private sanctuary designation, restricted access, minimal human intervention. She looked at Eleanor. That is, if someone with the financial resources was interested in establishing such a sanctuary. Eleanor thought of Henry's ashes, still in their urn back at their camp, and of the $30 million he'd left specifically for African wildlife conservation. She thought of David's childhood room, still unchanged after 5 years, full of stuffed lions and safari photographs. She thought of the empty house in Boston, the silent dinners, the meaningless social obligations of a world that had never felt like home. How much would it cost? She asked quietly. Initial setup, land acquisition, staffing, veterinary facilities? Sarah calculated quickly. Probably $25 million for the first 5 years. Eleanor looked at Jake, then at Marcus, then at the lionesses who had lost their leader protecting people they barely knew. Jake, would you consider staying? Running the day-to-day operations? Jake stared at her. Eleanor, I've got cancer. 6 months, maybe 8. Then we'll get you the best treatment money can buy. And if, Eleanor's voice caught, if the worst happens, you'll have trained someone to carry on, someone who understands what these lions represent. Marcus stepped forward. I'd like to volunteer. For whatever time I have left, I know every poaching route, every danger these cats face. Let me use that knowledge to protect instead of destroy. The male lion, Tommy, let out a low rumble that might have been approval. One of the surviving cubs, a female with Amara's distinctive ear markings, approached Eleanor and placed her tiny paw on the old woman's knee. Amara's daughter, Jake said softly. She's choosing you. Eleanor gently picked up the cub, feeling the warm weight of new life against her chest. Well then, I suppose we're all choosing each other. As rescue helicopters approached across the morning sky, bringing medical aid, government officials, and the complications of the outside world, Eleanor Hamilton made a decision that would reshape the rest of her life. She would not scatter Henry's ashes and return to Boston to die alone. She would build something here in the Serengeti, something that honored the sacrifice of 5 lionesses and the memory of a 12-year-old boy who had loved animals more than anything. The Hamilton Morrison Sanctuary would become a place where broken hearts could heal by helping heal others, where the bond between humans and lions could flourish under protection, and where the legacy of love could triumph over the legacy of loss. But first, they had to survive the attention of a world that would never quite understand what had really happened in the red dust of the Serengeti, when 5 lionesses chose love over survival and 3 broken humans learned that redemption sometimes comes with claws and teeth and the willingness to die for strangers. Tommy the lion stood for the first time since his surgery, his massive frame steady despite the bandages, and let out a roar that carried across the grassland like a promise that some bonds are stronger than death, and some love endures beyond the grave. 6 months later, Eleanor Hamilton stood on the wraparound porch of the Hamilton Morrison Wildlife Sanctuary headquarters, watching the African sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The sophisticated veterinary clinic behind her hummed with quiet activity as Dr. Sarah Mitchell completed the evening medical rounds, checking on 3 recovering lions, 2 leopards, and a young elephant calf that had been orphaned by poachers. In the distance, Tommy, fully recovered and magnificent in his prime, led his expanded pride of 12 lions toward the evening watering hole. His limp was barely noticeable now, and the scar on his leg served as a reminder of how close they had all come to losing everything that mattered. "Grandma Ellie?" The voice belonged to Emma Morrison, Jake's 16-year-old daughter, who had arrived 3 weeks ago for what was supposed to be a brief summer visit. She had fallen in love with Africa the moment she stepped off the plane, and now spent her days learning veterinary techniques from Eleanor and wildlife photography from Sarah. "What is it, sweetheart?" Eleanor smiled as the teenager bounded up the porch steps, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and her khaki clothes dusty from a day in the field. "Dad says to tell you the wedding preparations are ready whenever you are," Emma grinned. "And Marcus wants to know if you've decided on the menu for the reception." Eleanor's heart swelled with a happiness she hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow she would marry Jake Morrison in a simple ceremony beside the watering hole where they had first seen Tommy trapped and dying. Marcus would officiate. He had become an ordained minister as part of his rehabilitation program, and their guest list would include Tanzanian government officials, international conservation leaders, and most importantly, the lions who had brought them all together. Jake appeared from around the corner of the building, moving slowly but steadily. The cancer treatments in Switzerland had been successful, his oncologist declaring him in full remission just last month. His hair had grown back gray, and he was thinner than before, but his eyes held a light that Eleanor remembered from their first day together in the Serengeti. "Any second thoughts about marrying an old Marine with more scars than sense?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Only about whether I deserve this much happiness," Eleanor replied, leaning back against his chest. "Henry would have loved you, you know. He always said the best adventures happen when you stop planning and start living." Emma settled into one of the porch chairs, her expression suddenly serious. "Grandma Ellie, can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey. Do you think the lions really understand what they did for us? I mean, do you think Amara knew she was saving more than just your lives?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy's pride in the distance. 3 new cubs played near the water's edge, including Amara's daughter, now 6 months old and showing signs of her mother's exceptional intelligence. "I think," Eleanor said finally, "that Amara understood something that took us humans much longer to figure out. That love isn't about holding on to what you have, it's about giving everything to protect what matters most." Marcus approached from the direction of the clinic, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the kind of peaceful expression that had replaced the haunted look he'd carried for so long. His reformed hunter program had successfully retrained 47 former poachers as conservation officers, and his rehabilitation center for people struggling with grief had helped dozens of families across East Africa. "The evening medical reports," he announced, setting the champagne on the porch table. "All animals stable, all staff accounted for, all systems running smoothly. The Hamilton Morrison Sanctuary is officially ready for its first wedding." Jake squeezed Eleanor's shoulders. "Any word from Boston?" Eleanor nodded toward the stack of letters on the porch table. "The Hamilton Medical Foundation Board approved the additional funding, $50 million over the next 10 years for expansion." She paused, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And my lawyer called this afternoon. The Boston house sold for $16 million. All proceeds going to the sanctuary endowment." "You're really never going back," Emma said, wonder in her voice. "This is home now," Eleanor said simply. "This is where I belong." As if summoned by their conversation, the unmistakable sound of approaching paws made them all turn. Naya, now the pride's matriarch since Amara's death, was walking toward the porch with her characteristic confident stride. Behind her followed Hope, Zara, and 3 of the newer lionesses who had joined Tommy's pride over the past months. "Evening patrol," Jake chuckled, but his voice held deep affection. "They do this every night now. Check on us before settling in for the night." Nia approached the porch steps and sat down, her massive head tilted as she studied the humans. Her amber eyes held the same intelligence that Amara had possessed, the same uncanny ability to seem like she understood every word they spoke. "Hello, beautiful girl," Eleanor said softly, reaching into her pocket for the small pieces of dried meat she always carried. "Keeping us safe, as always?" The lioness accepted the treat with dignity, then did something that never failed to move Eleanor to tears. She placed one enormous paw on the porch step and lowered her head in what could only be described as a bow, a gesture of respect that she had begun making shortly after Amara's death, as if she understood her role as the bridge between the pride and the humans who had become part of their extended family. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the clinic, pulling off her surgical gloves and looking tired but satisfied. "All set for tomorrow's big day," she announced. "And I have news that I think you'll find interesting." Eleanor looked up expectantly. "The International Wildlife Conservation Union just approved our request," Sarah continued. "The Hamilton-Morrison Sanctuary model is being replicated in Kenya, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. We're not just saving lions, we're changing how the world thinks about human-wildlife coexistence." Emma leaned forward in her chair. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside her, "that what happened here, what your father and Eleanor and the lions accomplished together, is spreading. Other sanctuaries are adopting our methods, our philosophy. We're proving that humans and wildlife can not only coexist, but actively protect each other." Jake pointed toward the horizon where Tommy's pride was settling in for the night. "Look at them. Look how they've grown." The pride had indeed grown from the original 5 lionesses to a thriving community of 12 adults and 7 cubs. But more remarkably, their behavior had evolved. The cubs were being taught from birth to distinguish between humans who meant harm and those who offered help. The adults had begun what could only be described as patrol routes, regularly checking on ranger stations and even alerting authorities to poaching activities in neighboring regions. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice taking on the excitement that always accompanied her most significant discoveries. "The University of Cambridge wants to establish a permanent research station here, not to study the lions as subjects, but to learn from them as teachers. The behavioral innovations we've documented are being incorporated into wildlife management strategies across Africa." Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. Henry always said that the best legacies are the ones that outlive us, that keep growing long after we're gone. As full darkness settled over the Serengeti, the sounds of night began, the distant whooping of hyenas, the rustle of small creatures in the grass, the soft breathing of the lionesses who had chosen to rest near the porch. It was a symphony of life that Eleanor had learned to love, a reminder that she was no longer the isolated, grief-stricken widow who had come to Africa to die. Tomorrow she would marry the man who had helped her find her way back to living. She would celebrate surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family and the lions who had taught them all that love transcends species. And she would scatter Henry's ashes not in goodbye, but in gratitude, thanking him for leading her to this place, these people, this purpose that had transformed her final years into the most meaningful of her life. Emma reached over and took her hand. "Happy, Grandma Ellie?" Eleanor squeezed the young woman's fingers and looked out at the pride of lions who had given her a reason to hope again. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible, sweetheart. Happier than I ever dreamed possible." The stars emerged one by one in the vast African sky, and Eleanor Hamilton, soon to be Eleanor Morrison, felt the deep contentment that comes from finally being exactly where you belong. My dear friends, if you're listening to this story and feeling that familiar ache in your chest, the one that whispers, "It's too late for me," I want you to know that Eleanor Hamilton felt exactly the same way at 72. She had buried her husband of 52 years, lost her only son, and was sitting in an empty Boston mansion planning to end her own story. But sometimes God places lions in our path to remind us that love doesn't end with loss, it transforms into purpose. Eleanor discovered that her greatest adventure wasn't behind her. It was waiting in the red dust of Africa, in the amber eyes of creatures who understood that protecting others is how we heal ourselves. She found a new family, a new mission, and a love deeper than she'd ever imagined possible. At 72, she didn't just survive her grief, she built a legacy that saved lives and changed the world. Your chapters aren't finished, dear friends. Your greatest love story might still be unwritten. Sometimes the most broken hearts become the strongest, and sometimes the last act is the most beautiful of all. The lions are still teaching us it's never too late to choose love over loss. Questions for you. What dream did you put aside that's still calling to your heart? If you could start over tomorrow, what would your new adventure look like? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters, and we're all listening.